Welcome to Global Perspectives. How well do you understand the Middle East? Professor Eitan Gilboa, who has experience at multiple institutions in the United States and Israel, offers an interdisciplinary perspective.
Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to the show, Professor Gilboa.
My pleasure.
Why don't we start with maybe a step back to before you were an esteemed academic in the United States and Israel, and talk about what you were doing, what you were thinking about as you were growing up. Did you anticipate you would become a professor?
I was very interested in international relations. And when you study this field, you have basically four options. You can run for politics and become a minister or an ambassador. You can be a high-level official. You can do foreign relations in a television studio, or you can become academic. On my list, academic did not appear at all. I was very much interested in either serving in the government or doing journalism. But as it happened, I was too good of a student to do these inferior jobs. And I was sent to the United States by my home university, the Hebrew University, to study international relations at Harvard University. And when I came back, I was among those who founded the Department of International Relations at the Hebrew University. I studied at Harvard in the early 70s. I figured for myself what kind of a topic I would like to research. And then I decided, well, the United States is a superpower. At that time, there were not too many experts on the United States in Israel. So I selected to specialize in American foreign policy in the Middle East. I knew that this would give me a lot of work, no matter what.
Endless work, and that's still true today. But you also bring a very interdisciplinary perspective to this issue. So in addition to American foreign policy in the Middle East and the Middle East as a general subject area, your experience in terms of international communication, diplomacy, public diplomacy, the list goes on. It sounds like you are 4 or 5 professors rolled into one. How did you develop those other, it sounds like they stemmed from some of what you were just talking about.
Exactly right. I've done journalism all my life. I write op-ed articles. I had radio and television programs, especially on foreign affairs. But what really moved me into the field of international relations and public diplomacy was the visit of President of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, in Israel in 1977. This visit was 95% media and psychology, and only 5% diplomatic substance. And then I thought that images are so important from politics, and the media is shaping images, that perhaps I should make it another field of my research. And obviously you cannot understand the United States domestic scene and politics, and you cannot understand American foreign policy without looking at the communication and journalism fields.
And this, of course, is evolving in the United States as it is around the world, especially since the end of the Cold War, when the news media in this country changed dramatically as a result of that event and also advances in technology. But talk to us about the news media today from your perspective. You indicated that it played such a critical role in the evolution of the American political system and foreign policy issues as well. What about today, when the sort of mainstream news media organizations are less influential, less numerous as a group than they were a decade and a half, 2 decades ago?
It's hard to say that the media have been doing a good job on foreign affairs. To do a good job, it meant to have reporters in many countries and to have many bureaus. Unfortunately, due to budgetary constraints, major newspapers and media outlets have cut down on foreign reporters, and therefore reporting is now based mostly on what news agencies are providing. Coverage today, even in most of the excellent newspapers such as the New York Times or the Guardian or the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung in Germany, is somewhat deficient. If you depend only on newspapers and the media for information about foreign affairs in general, and on the region I'm coming from, the Middle East in particular, you would not understand what is really happening.
Is there a way to fix that problem? Because it was hard enough when news media were really prominent to get people to read and engage, and now that they're getting information, sometimes that information, word information needs to be put in quotation marks. Who knows what the source of that is? And so, in my opinion, the average person probably has more access to information than ever before, but it's not necessarily the best information.
Exactly. We have been told for many years that the more media outlets we have, the more pluralism we have, the better informed we are going to be. Turns out that with the coming of the internet and the social networks, everybody has become a reporter. Everybody has this cell phone and takes pictures and can produce videos, but we cannot really know whether or not those reports and visuals are reliable. We don't know under what circumstances they are taken. We don't know if the reporter or the photographer has an agenda that interferes in the way reporting is done. There is a whole warfare in the social media about foreign affairs. Much of it is completely inaccurate, misleading, or fabricated. I don't buy the idea of fake news that President Trump is playing with. But a lot of stuff that you see on the internet is highly problematic. I am very concerned about it because I believe that we cannot have democracy without independent and trustful media. I have conducted research about trust in media institutions and liberal democracies. And in the United States, in my own country, in Israel, and in some other Western liberal democracies, the public simply mistrusts the media in growing numbers. In the United States, for example, television and newspapers are located at the bottom of the scale. And this is also true in Israel. In Israel and the United States, the institution that received much of the trust is the military. What does it say about democracy and our confidence in institutions? And when leaders such as President Trump are attacking day in and day out the media and accuses everybody of fabricating and pursuing fake news, I think this is undermining one of the pillars of democracy.
I agree, and so much has changed. Like you, I spent a lot of time in graduate school studying the field of international relations and spent a long time in the news media business where there was a system in place, expectations. You did very careful grading and analysis of news. You had a separation between news coverage reporting and news coverage commentary, so that, and it was clearly identified as such. And you brought people in who had the background and who had the contacts. And I agree with you. Having reporters on the scene is exactly what you need, not wire services and even worse, freelance writers. Sometimes they can be very good and sometimes they can be very bad and misinformed.
And what is really missing is what you have just mentioned, is good commentary. Because international events today are very complex, especially in the Middle East. And if you don't have people who specialize in the area, are experts in politics, religion, culture, without which you cannot understand the Middle East, then it's much more difficult to understand what is happening and why. And secondly, there is too much mixture of news and views. There should be much more separation. People who do commentary should not do reports and vice versa.
I couldn't agree more, but unfortunately you are seeing that happen more and more. And we could talk about this for the entire show. I don't want to do that, even though I'm tempted. But if you could fix one aspect of the way we cover news in terms of reporting and commentary and make it happen quickly, is there something that is achievable that we could do to improve this problem that you've just described so well?
Since there are so many financial constraints on media outlets, perhaps the best solution is not feasible these days, because in order to accomplish separation, you need big stuff, and you need more people to represent you abroad, and you need people who read books and learn the languages, and not people who are parachuting into a state. They meet a number of people and then they write commentary which seems to be an in-depth analysis, but in fact is a very superficial treatment of highly complex issues.
And the old practice, and I realize we're talking about the way news was covered, evaluated in many, many years past, but the old practice was to try to build an understanding of the subject matter over time, so that when you were vertically inserted into a crisis, you weren't just talking to the people you happened to run into. You already had your contacts, you had background information, and then you met additional people on the ground, but it was more well-rounded, it was broader. You had some understanding of the subject matter.
Yes, and when you have all kinds of surprises to policymakers as well as to the general public. And I always am amazed why policymakers who have so many intelligence agencies, I think the United States has more than 20 agencies, why they are surprised. For example, the so-called Arab Spring surprised everybody. The removal of Hosni Mubarak of Egypt was a big surprise. The winning of Mohamed Morsi of the elections in Egypt was a big surprise. The survival of Bashar Assad was a big surprise. Everybody predicted that he's going to go like Mubarak, like Saddam Hussein, like Muammar Gaddafi. He's still with us today. And then everybody was surprised by the Russian intervention in Syria. Yes, there's always room for political and diplomatic and military surprises of this kind. But I think more fundamental reading of fundamental processes in foreign regions, critical for peace and security in the world, would perhaps at least allow some room for unexpected developments. And I'm arguing that we should expect the unexpected, especially in a place like the Middle East.
Absolutely, absolutely. Help us understand. We're looking at the Middle East. The average person responds to events. Oh, there's a crisis in Iraq. There's an issue involving petroleum. There's some sort of clash between cultures. They don't have the sort of broad perspective you have, where all the different parts of the mosaic fit together, and you understand why and how that happened historically and how it's happening now. But if you were trying to help the average viewer of this show understand a little bit more about the Middle East, what would be some fundamentals that you would recommend?
The first thing is to look at maps, because without geopolitics, it's very difficult to understand why processes happen, uses of force, terrorism, diplomacy, and peacemaking when possible. The second thing would be to understand the significant place religion, culture, and history play in international politics, especially in the Middle East. Americans, I hate to say, are ahistorians. They don't understand the significance of history because maybe your history is short relative to the history of ancient empires in the Middle East. And there is also a tendency to underrate culture. and religion. Religion is a tremendous force in the Middle East. Without the historical schism between the Sunni and the Shiites, the two main streams in Islam, there is no way one can understand what has happening in Syria and Iraq in the last few years. And the only way to gain a good perspective about history and culture and religion is to read books. So even if the media would have done a much better job in covering foreign affairs, still the average person has to read introductory or textbooks about the region. And obviously, most people either don't have the time or have the energy. And even people who are supposed to know, politicians, government officials, journalists, and even academics are not doing it. I find with my students significant reliance on highly questionable sources, such as Wikipedia. With all the respect I have for Wikipedia, this is not a good source for reliable information about complex situations. We live in an era of video clips, very fast style of learning and understanding. So you want to understand fast what's going on. And if you do it too fast, you get superficial, and the end result is that you are confused. You don't understand what is happening and why. And in the case of policymakers or lawmakers, this could easily lead to serious errors in judgment and policymaking.
So people need to understand maps, to read more, but they may not be inclined to do so. So how do we share this knowledge? How do we deepen their understanding of these very complicated
I also
situations?
need to add that I'm quite concerned about the way, at least the Middle East, and also maybe international politics are being taught in American universities. There's too much politics in the classroom, too much ideology. I think that people who come out from many Middle Eastern programs, even at the best universities, taught by people with agenda, ideology, politics, and when they come out, they don't understand what is happening. And when it comes to graduates in Middle Eastern studies, in American universities, who join the CIA or the State Department, then they don't really know what is happening. And I think we can see the results in major failures and misunderstanding of successive American administrations, be it Democratic or Republican. I think what I'm arguing is that it doesn't matter who is in power. There are serious deficiencies in our knowledge and understanding of significant international processes. People cannot properly analyze what is happening, and obviously, if you cannot identify the question, you will never get a proper answer.
So this sounds like it's becoming more and more complicated and frustrating. Is there a way out?
Yes, I'm very frustrated, and I think that we have created this organization called Israel Public Diplomacy Forum, a non-profit, educational, academic, non-partisan organization, among other things, to expand basic knowledge and understanding of what is happening in Israel and the Middle East. And we engage all kinds of organizations that are interested in learning in depth about the Middle East. So we are delivering lectures at the University of Central Florida and other universities, but also we engage councils of foreign relations, chambers of commerce, churches and synagogues, Rotary clubs, every organization that wants to better understand or to understand what is happening and why, and what could perhaps happen in the future, then we partner with. We're trying to be objective as much as possible. There's no such thing as a 100% value-free journalist or value-free scholar. But if you are aware of those limitations, you can do a better job. So we are trying to fulfill a deficiency in both in the United States and Europe. Because I have to tell you that my experience with Europe is they don't know, not the average person, the elites don't know much more than the elites in the United States about international affairs.
And that's a shame, because most people would jump to the conclusion that they do know more because of proximity, history, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly right. But I was surprised to find that out. And so we are working also in Europe to correct that situation.
So in terms of Israel specifically, you talked about this nonprofit organization you have. What is one of the most important points that you're trying to get across to your audiences? What is it that you want them to understand that they may not understand at this point?
The main thing is that the challenges are serious, very difficult to handle. There is not one good solution. All of the solutions, or most of the solutions, are limited and problematic, and that you have to have a lot of patience. There's no such thing as a quick fix. Take, for example, the issue of the Iran nuclear weapons program. Extremely difficult. There isn't a good option to stop Iran. Everybody agrees on goals. The disagreement is usually on ways to achieve these goals. So, for example, the Iran nuclear deal has been very controversial in Israel, in the United States, in the Middle East. I remember that as a strategy to reduce the effect of the Israeli opposition, President Obama said only Israel opposed the deal. No, this was not accurate, because all of the Arab Sunni countries and some others have opposed the deal for all kinds of reasons. You can debate the merits of the deal, but the facts have to be presented in a fair way.
I appreciate that, and I wish we had more time to go into more details on that and other issues, but we have run out of time, so I'd like to thank you, Professor Gilboa, for joining us today.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak about these issues.
Thank you. And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.